Hey guys, it's Kyle Thompson here with the Thrust My Real Estate Group, and in today's video, I'm going to be covering tenant-occupied properties. It doesn't matter if you're an investor or if you're looking for a home that has a suite to help with the mortgage, or maybe the property that you're interested in just has tenants. Tenants are a common occurrence in the real estate industry. However, often people either don't understand the tenancy rules, or they think they do, but they're confused about some points, or they just don't understand the risks involved in buying a property that has tenants. So in today's video, I'm going to try to clear some of that up. As always, if you have any questions, please leave them in the comment section below or reach out to me directly. All of my contact info is in the description. This will probably be a fairly long video, so I'll put the timestamps down in the description, and if you feel like you already understand certain parts of this, feel free to jump ahead. First off, these rules will apply to single-family dwellings, duplex, triplex, townhomes, strata properties, basement suites, carriage houses, pretty much everything other than mobiles in mobile home parks. Those have their own tenancy rules, so it will be different. There are fixed term tenancies, and then there are month-to-month tenancies. If someone's in a fixed term and you want them to leave, you really only have a couple of options. You can wait until the tenancy is up, or you can try to get them to sign what's called a mutual agreement to end tenancy. Often what happens in this situation is the landlord will offer the tenant some sort of financial compensation. Essentially, they end up bribing them out in order to sign the mutual agreement to end tenancy. If the tenant doesn't want to sign, then you have to just wait until the tenancy is up. You cannot ask them to leave, even for personal use. It is worth noting that fixed tenancies automatically turn into month-to-month tenancies when the tenancy is up. So if you do want them to leave, you still will have to give the required notice. Now, what constitutes the required notice will change depending on the intended use of the property. You can ask the tenant to vacate for personal use or for the use of a close family member. A close family member is defined as a child or a parent of the landlord or the landlord's spouse. Siblings, cousins, aunts, uncles, anything like that doesn't count. In this circumstance, you have to give the tenant 2 months' notice, and you need to compensate them with the equivalent of 1 month's rent. Often the tenants will just take the last month free of rent in lieu of cash. It is important to note that the date that notice is given is important. The 2 months starts at the pay period for the tenant. So if they pay rent on the 1st and they get notice on the 10th of the month, then the 2 months doesn't start until the 1st of the following month. So depending on when you give your notice, the 2 months notice could actually be a lot closer to 3. There is also an option to have the tenants vacate for demolishing the unit, changing the intended use, or for substantial renovations. In these circumstances, you need to give the tenants 4 months' notice, and you still need to compensate them with the equivalent of 1 month's rent. These are often referred to as renovations. However, these are becoming increasingly more difficult to do, because essentially what was happening is people were abusing these so that they could get tenants out that were paying too low of rent. So the government stepped in and they've made the process a lot more difficult. Now you need to apply for an order of possession from the RTB before the work commences, and an arbitrator will have to come out and determine that the only way that the work can be done is for the tenant to leave. So when they say substantial renovations, they do mean substantial. We're talking taking things right down to the beams, switching out plumbing, electrical, that sort of thing. Just changing out the floors and painting or putting in a new kitchen or something won't be enough. The tenants technically could still live in the property during those kinds of renovations. Those are the basics on tenancies. There is also a 1 month to evict a tenant in the event that they're doing a bunch of stuff they shouldn't be, or a 10-day in the event that they're not paying rent, but in order to keep this video from being an hour long, we'll just have to glaze over that because it won't affect most people when they're looking to purchase. If you have any questions about that, feel free to reach out anytime. I'd be happy to go over it with you. For now, let's move on to how to deal with tenants when buying a home. The first thing you need to do is decide whether you want to keep the tenants or you're going to ask them to vacate. If you want to keep them, the process is pretty straightforward. You just need to review the lease and relevant documentation. You're going to want to review the lease, the last time the rent was increased, the move-in inspection report, any residential tenancy arbitrations, any emails or written communications between the tenant and the landlord, and if the property is a strata property, a executed Form K. Finally, you'll just want to make sure that any money that is owed to the tenants for things like damage or pet deposits are credited to the buyer when the deal completes, as the new landlord will be on the hook for any money owed to the tenants. That's pretty much it when it comes to assuming the tenants. Like I said, pretty straightforward. In the event that you want the tenants to vacate, the first thing you'll need to do is determine if they're in the fixed term or a month-to-month. and then determine how much time it will be before you can legally ask them to vacate. If they're in a month to month, I find the easiest way to do this is just to have the seller give the notice to vacate and then wait a couple of months before you take possession, as I find it just causes the least amount of problems. Why is that? Well, because like I mentioned earlier, the landlord is on the hook for any monies owed to the tenant or any problems that come up with ending the tenancy. Whereas if you just have the seller give the notice and you wait until the tenancy is over, then you just move into a vacant home and you avoid any potential problems with the tenants. However, this won't always be feasible, so you might have to have the seller give notice to the tenants and then take possession before the tenants vacate, or you might have to take possession of the property and then give the notice to the tenants yourself. This can come up in circumstances where, say, the seller needs the proceeds from this sale to buy another property in a certain amount of time, or maybe the buyer has a rate hold and that rate hold will expire before the tenants get the required notice, so you'll end up paying a lot more money on your loan. If something like this comes up, just make sure, like before, that you get all of the proper documentation to review and that you have all of the money owed to the tenants credited to you when the deal completes. Finally, let's discuss some of the issues that can arise when buying a home that has tenants. One issue that can arise is when giving notice to the tenant near the pay period. When the landlord gives notice to the tenant to vacate, they have to do so on the proper form, they need to have a witness, and depending on the method at which the notice was given, there is a delay on when it is considered received. If the landlord gives the notice in person, it's deemed accepted right away. If the notice is posted in a visible place, like on front of the door or in a mailbox, that is 3 days. But if it is sent by registered mail, then it isn't deemed accepted until 5 days later. Why this can be an issue is that if the notice isn't given the proper way, and you say the notice is given on the 30th of a month, well, if it's given in person, then it's deemed accepted immediately. Whereas if it was left on the door or sent by mail, then it wouldn't be deemed accepted until several days later, in which case it would be after the pay period, so you would end up having to wait almost an entire full extra month to get into your property. Another issue that can arise is if the tenants don't leave, even though they've been given the proper notice. If this happens, it can take months to essentially have them forced out of the home, and this can be a problem, obviously, if you've already moved out of your old place and you're planning to move into the new one. There's no way to completely mitigate this risk, but there are things that you can do to help lower the risk. How it's dealt with will be on a case-to-case basis, but it is worth noting the risk. In the event that you're assuming the tenants, there are risks as well. If the tenants are bad or uncooperative tenants and they're causing a lot of problems, it can be very difficult to end the tenancy once it's been established. This is why it's important to do proper due diligence before you buy the property. If you do end up with bad tenants, there are only a limited amount of ways that you can actually have them forced out of the home, and the burden of proof is quite high. In the meantime, the tenants can cause damage to the home, which you may be compensated for, but in many cases you aren't, and even if you are compensated, it can often take a very long time before you receive that compensation. Another risk is the restrictions on raising the rent. Just because you are the new owner of the home doesn't mean that you can change the prior lease, and you can only raise the rent once a year, and the amount that you're allowed to raise the rent is determined by the government. Just because someone's lease is up doesn't mean that you can change the terms of the lease. As I mentioned before, fixed-term tenancies automatically turn into month-to-month tenancies when the term is ended. So if the rent is too low and you need to re-rent it out to somebody else, you can't really kick the tenants out. You need to have a legitimate reason to ask the tenants to leave, and low rent is not considered a legitimate reason. This can affect you in a couple of ways. One is that the home may be affordable at the time that you take out the mortgage, but if rates go up and you can't raise the rent by enough to help compensate, then you might end up being underwater on your mortgage. Another way that this can affect you is that if you have long-term tenants and they are renting for well below market value, then it can affect your resale value, as a lot of people are looking at buying homes that have tenants in them as either investment properties or to help offset the cost of a mortgage. But if the tenants are paying really low rent, then it is less advantageous for a future buyer. There are, of course, other risks involved, but those are just some of the most common ones. I think this video is long enough, so we're going to call it quits there. I really hope that you got some value out of this video. If you did, please consider liking and subscribing to my YouTube channel. And finally, if you ever have any questions, Please feel free to leave them in the comment section below or reach out to me directly, and I'll get back to you as soon as I am able. Thanks for watching.